Your speaker today. Let me remind you of the events next week. On Tuesday, you are all very unlucky because I will be giving the talk. So you can listen to me talk about Milgram's experiment and what Milgram's experiment tells us about how bad each of us really is.
Will we have buttons?
You will have button whenever I say something wrong. you can shock the speaker. And on Friday, the following talk is online. We are welcoming back a former fellow, Alan Franklin, who was a senior visiting fellow a few years ago. You can find the link to his talk on the website, and the talk will be about replication in physics. He has a very short book on the topic that was published a few years ago, and I will be talking about that matter at noon on Friday. The following week, it's spring break, so we will not be meeting. You can do some philosophy for a change. The last thing I wanted to tell you is that the program for the conference Arnon is organizing is now online. The conference is revitalizing science and values, so the relation, the place and role of values in science. And you can check the 2 days and a half conference program on our website. Today, it's my great pleasure to reintroduce Arnon Levy, who is Associate Professor of Philosophy in the Department of Philosophy at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Arnon has been with us for 2 years already, nearly 2 years. He's our senior visiting fellow this year. We've been really lucky to have you around. He's been a wonderful person here at the center, and I'm very grateful actually for that. As you all know, Arnon is a philosopher of biology, but it's also a general question in philosophy of science. His work on modeling, on explanation, in the philosophy of biology, work on the notion of information, on the whether organisms are machines, among many other topics. One of the topics he's been working on is the place of imagination in science. He has edited a book on that topic called Scientific Imagination with Peter Achinstein, and he is finishing a book with Routledge on the relation between understanding and explanation, and the title is Explanation and Understanding. Provisional title. So the title might change in the future. It's published widely on any of these topics on the best journal of philosophy and philosophy of science. Today it's my pleasure to listen to you. So go for it, Arnon. Take it
Thank you very much. Thanks, Warren. Thanks for showing up. So as I guess pretty much everyone in philosophy of science knows, the kind of fountainhead for modern discussions of explanations, Hempel and Oppenheim. And while Hempel's views are no longer accepted, I think in many ways the agenda that Hempel set for philosophical discussions of explanation is kind of alive and well. The early views that Hempel was sort of chief representative of sought to a kind of balance between recognizing explanation, scientific explanation, as a distinctive achievement, something more than mere description of phenomena, but something that also could be objectively assessed, that there were objective criteria for assessing as explanations. And in particular, Hempel here rejected the appeal to psychological states and in particular understanding, but was also subject to pretty strict empiricist, or what was then seen as strict empiricist criteria. And the result was what you might call, I don't think it's usually called that, but I'm going to sort of frame it as a syntactic view of explanation. The best known representative of that is, of course, the DN model from Hempel himself, the idea that explanation is a valid deductive argument with a law as one of its premises that entails the explanative phenomenon, or the explanative, which is the thing of the phenomenon, but also later views, in particular Kitcher's version of unificationism, is also wedded to this kind of syntactic thinking about explanation. Those syntactic views have by now very widely known problems. Let's just quickly mention a few of them. Formal relations of the sort that Hempel and Fischer were concerned with, deductive entailment, and so on, do not track explanatory relevance, as shown by flagpole type cases. You can run the flagpole. Flagpole can entail the length of the shadow can entail the length of the flagpole, but the explanation doesn't seem to run in both ways. There's also a serious problem about the fit with practice. So a lot of actual scientific explanations don't seem to have the kind of form that Hempel, but also unificationist type account suggests. And what they do seem to have is causal mechanistic content in many cases, which doesn't form part of these accounts. Another problem, which I think is a little bit less visible in some of these discussions, is that especially Hempel's views, but also to an extent, the kind of picture type view had a problem accounting for explanatory power, by which I basically just mean saying what makes some explanations better than others. Hempel's gestures at ideas of explanatory sketches and schemas, but it's not, there's no clear view of that. And you might think that actually the picture type view does better, but it turns out that they're not going to get into that, but there are actually some serious problems with the idea of explanatory power under that view as well. So this was sort of led in the kind of 1980s, 1990s to a move from the syntactic type of view to what you might think of as semantic view, where the semantic view defines explanation by its factual content, basically. What does the explanation tell us about the world? And typically, the idea is it should tell us something about the causal, mechanistic underpinnings of the phenomenon. Another way to put this, and I'll sort of move relatively freely between these two ways of putting it, is to think of explanation as causal description. An explanation describes the causes and mechanisms that underlie the phenomenon. Now, I think if there is a current view that is maybe somewhat similar to the status that Hempel's view had in the, I don't know, 60s, mid-60s, it's roughly this view. And I think that's both in the sense that it's like, if there is a received view, a generally accepted basic idea, it's more or less this, but there are also a lot of voices of dissent, and there might be a kind of moving away from that view. So what I want to do in light of this kind of brief is start out by presenting some things that I see as challenges to this semantic view, having to do with idealization and related practices, with the questions about explanatory power and with non-causal explanation. Then talk about some recent reactions to these problems. None of these problems are my sort of novel. I've done some work on them. A lot of other people have as well. These suggestions, I'm going to try to sort of give them a kind of unifying kind of framing. And that is by sort of syntactic, semantic, pragmatic, going pragmatic in a sense that I'll explain. I'm also going to talk a little bit about how this relates to older so-called pragmatic views of explanation. And the idea there is I'll rely on a kind of quote from Kim, which I see as a kind of expressing a kind of truism about explanation, and that is that its explanation is directed at understanding, or it has understanding as its goal. And what I'll try to, there are various things that can be said about this view, but I'll try to kind of sketch it in outline, and then try to say that it can help us with the problems with the semantic view. And then in the end, I want to say a little bit more about how I understand this shift from semantic to pragmatic and what it involves and what it doesn't involve. I want to emphasize there's a lot of detail that I could go into at various points, and I've decided to try to paint a big picture. In some cases, maybe the majority of cases, I do have some details and I could supply them. In others, I don't. But I'm trying to sort of emphasize this big picture and see what you make of it as a kind of approach or kind of, way of framing these issues. Okay, so recent philosophy has discussed a range of cases of, broadly speaking, non-causal explanation. Some of these are explanations that are may be relatively close to causal explanation, but seem to not turn on describing the causes and mechanisms underlying a phenomenon. So an example is like explanations that appeal to laws of conservation, like the explanation of why the Earth spins on its axis, which crucially turns on the idea of conservation of angular momentum as the Earth cooled down. More striking, perhaps, are cases of what's sometimes called, following Mark Lang, distinctively mathematical explanations. A well-known example in this context is the explanation of the periodical life cycles of cicadas. So, maybe I'll say a little bit more on that. These insects, which are common in most of the eastern half of the United States, have interesting life cycles of 13 or 17 years. By the way, I read this online. This year, both the 13 and the 17 are emerging. Last time this happened, Jefferson was the president, and it's never going to happen in any of our lifetimes. So if you want to check it out, it's go down south in about a month's time. Anyway, these critters emerge in these interesting periods. And one explanation, I think there's some debate over this, but one explanation that evolutionary biologists have put forward for this is that periodical life cycles of this sort, because of the primeness of the number, of the length of the period, minimize the intersection with other possible periods, and in particular with periodical life cycles of predators. So this idea, an evolutionary story, is why they have these life cycles. It sort of minimizes their vulnerability to predators, periodical predators. If you think about the idea of explanation as causal description, then these kinds of cases, and there are a lot of others besides people brought up, pose a problem to the causal aspect, right? So if you think of it as kind of what I call a semantic view in a relatively narrow sense, then this poses a type of problem for the idea of explanation's causal description. There's also a somewhat subtler problem, I think, for the semantic idea, and that is that it seems hard to say what the content of the explanation is, and specifically in what sense the explanation's content is non-causal. So on the one hand, these examples, all of the examples that I know of, but let's focus on the cicada case, have causal content. They depend on facts about the periodic life cycle of the cicadas, the selection pressures they're on, the process of evolution by natural selection, all that. But on the other hand, pretty much any explanation will, or many explanations will utilize mathematics and logic. And so in some sense, doing the explanation depends on quantifying, using mathematics in some sense or other non-causal aspects. So the question is like, whether there's something special, there does seem to be something special about these explanations. What is special about them? How to account for that? One line says, this is kind of basically an appearance only. So Chris Pincock, to an extent, Michael Strevens, have essentially argued that many of these cases, if not all of them, can be understood as just ordinary, boring uses of mathematics that look a little bit special, but they're not really. Once you look into them, essentially the mathematics is just helping us describe the causal situation in some kind of abstract or indirect way. And I think, I think that goes some way, but I think there's a problem. It really does ignore the interesting character of these explanations. There does seem to be a kind of, what clinches the explanation does seem in many of these cases to be a mathematical fact. Another way to answer this question has been proposed by Mark Lang, following him, Mark Povich, in a book that devoted to non-causal explanations just about to come out. And the Lang view is, well, we have to look very closely at the context. In the context in which a certain explanatory question is asked, a lot of causal facts are presupposed, and given all those presuppositions about the periods, about there being natural selection, and so on and so forth, the sort of thing that really makes the difference, he doesn't usually use that phrase, but like the sort of what clinches the explanation is mathematical fact, like the co-primeness of the life cycle period. I think of that as like really quite ad hoc in many ways, right? You have to work quite hard, and if you're interested in looking, Holly Anderson has a nice paper in which she kind of goes through this and shows that you can, like, in very subtle ways, change what the explanandum is, and you get a mathematical versus a causal explanation. Even if you don't think it's very ad hoc, and I assume that Lang would say it's not very ad hoc, at least his judgments are not very ad hoc on this score, it does show that there's quite a bit of the contextual pragmatic aspects that go into shaping the explanation through this kind of very delicate kind of shaping of what the phenomenon to be explained is. So I think it's at least hard to sort of understand explanation here in purely sort of in kind of strongly, as I call them, semantic terms, in terms of what the factual content of the explanation is, in a way that preserves non-causal aspect of these explanations. What I think of as a more direct and in many ways more fundamental problem for the semantic view is the presence of idealization in many explanations. And here by idealization, I mean the deliberate introduction of assumptions which, at least if read literally, are not accurate, not true descriptions of the phenomenon. So there's been a lot of discussion on this in philosophy of science. I won't go over many cases. Some of these cases, like those that Batterman and Rice discuss, and also Coolidge discusses, are cases where at least these authors argue the idealizations are necessary for the explanation. And there's quite a bit of detail there to discuss whether that's correct or not. But Coolidge, for instance, looks at Bohr's explanation of the spectral lines of the hydrogen atoms and she says those rely on the assumption of stable classical orbits. That assumption Bohr knew to be, or we know to be an idealization, a pretty severe idealization, but she thinks you can't get, or at least it's going to be very hard to get the Balmer formula and the spectral lines out of that kind of model without it. Angelo Potocznik discusses mainly explanations in biology, for instance, the use of the prisoner's dilemma to account for altruistic behavior. Potocznik, I think, is a little bit less, I think she's a little bit less clear, but that's because she's probably a little bit more hesitant about the essentiality claim, whether you have to have the idealization in order to get the explanation. But I think, in a sense, it's not obvious that this is so crucial to the problem. So if you think that the basic problem here is that there's a kind of gap between what the explanatory model says and the factors on which the explanandum actually depends, then maybe that's made especially acute if these sort of idealizing assumptions are absolutely essential to the explanation. But I think even, and this I think is what Angela thinks as well, even if it's not essential, so long as the idealized explanation is in many ways better, more illuminating, then we have a kind of, at least a question here, at least a kind of apparent problem or tension between the idea of explanation as causal description and, or explanation that's kind of defined by its factual content and the presence of idealization. I think of a class of cases that involve modeling, analogy and metaphor as maybe less important and less prominent, but as involving something that is kind of continuous and similar to what we see in cases of idealization. So I've written quite a bit about cases in this context from biology, for instance, the notion of information and informational metaphors in cell biology, genetic coding, other interactions between cells. Also, cases of machine analogies in molecular biology, molecular motors is an important example. In these cases, I think it's going to be pretty hard to suggest that there's an essential reliance on the metaphor, but there is an importance of this metaphor, which is at least in large part explanatory. These metaphors are an effective way of delivering an explanation, and if you think that they're important, or if you're just interested in how they work, I think there's some interesting continuities. So it's kind of another kind of addendum to the And here there's clearly a departure from the idea of explanation as a form of description. Right? If you think of these as real cases. Okay, the final thing I want to discuss as a kind of challenge to this semantic approach is the question of how to account for explanatory power, which I mentioned earlier too. What makes some explanations better than others? A very strict application of the semantic causal description view would say that basically the more informative an explanation is about the causal situation, the better it is. There's very few people who hold this. I think the only person who sort of pretty much said this is David Lewis in an interesting classic paper on this. I think of as very interesting, but I don't accept much of what he says there. And I think both the presence of both idealization and abstraction, namely the omission of causal detail, speaks against this kind of simple idea of explanatory power as causal informative. In a recent paper, Kaplan and Craver and Kaplan argue that really this simple view is like just a misunderstanding. What a sort of a view of this sort should say is that explanatorily relevant information, the more of it the explanation contains, the better it is. But an immediate problem there is that when they understand explanatorily relevant is causally relevant. So it turns out to be a pretty similar view, I think, in the end, to the kind of view that Lewis had. They're not insensitive to this, they don't put it this way, but what they say kind of in a way of responding to this is, well, what you need to do is think very carefully about explananda. Explananda in general should be understood in contrastive terms. We should explain, why it's raining rather than snowing today, why it's raining today rather than yesterday, and many explanations, they omit a lot of explanatory causal information by just focusing on what makes the difference in that sort of contrastive way. That goes some way, I think, towards addressing the issue. But one thing, there are different things that we could say about this. I don't want to go into too much detail. But one thing I think we can immediately say is that there at least seem apparently to be explanations which aren't contrastive. Right? So contrastive explanations, usually it's put in why question terms. Why is it raining today rather than snowing? But if you think there's a large class of how explanations in biology. How does the cell replicate DNA? Seems to me like a very good explanatory question, and you can give an answer to it. I think it's not obvious whether you can apply this kind of contrastive device to that. So I don't think this is a settled discussion, and I'm not even 100% sure what I think about all of this, but there are at least open questions. Okay. All of these problems, I've not sort of come up with them myself. As I mentioned, I contributed to some of these debates, but I haven't I think there's a lot of other people who have written about them. And there consequently have been some reactions, quite a bunch of reactions to these issues. A range of authors who have written about this suggest what I see as three related ideas. One is that explanation is a matter of pointing to dependency relations, which include but are not limited to causal dependencies. That's mainly in response to the non-causal explanations. A second idea is that idealized and potentially also abstract models work by enhancing understanding. And that's despite of not sort of describing quite accurately, they sort of somehow make a contribution to understanding. And importantly, a lot of people think that understanding can be given a kind of objective or objectively accessible account. And a third idea is explanation and understanding are in some intimate way related to inferential ability. And what I want to suggest in the rest of the talk is that what we're seeing here is a kind of shift from the semantic view, which identifies an explanation with its causal content, to something that we might think of as a pragmatic approach. And I'll try to say more about that. Here are a few quotes, just to sort of show you that these views are out there. I don't want to necessarily read them all, but these are some of the authors that have done quite a bit of work on this. Elisa Bakulich, which I mentioned before, Kate Elgin, Angela Potocnik, Lieutenant Mertz is a kind of earlier version of this, but also Christo, Insalolar, Alex Stortman, a bunch of others. And in a way, I think also Jim Woodward's work, and I'll comment a little bit on that. I see it, and it'd be interesting to hear what you think. I see it as kind of have shifted a little bit in this regard from something that was, I think of as more semantic in its kind of orientation in around the 2003 book, to emphasizing sort of reasoning and inferences as it's put there, licensed by the model. And I think of that as partly in reaction to some of these issues. This particular quote is from a paper on non-causal explanation. So what does it mean to move to kind of a semantic, from a semantic to a pragmatic outlook? Sometimes the word pragmatics is, as Geary says here in a somewhat different context, it's used as a kind of catch-all for everything that we don't want to really talk about. It's all that messy stuff that we don't really know how to theorize, and we're just going to leave it aside. Lewis says that very explicitly in that 86 paper. Praver says something kind of similar in a more recent paper. And that's not obviously what I have in mind. What I have in mind is pragmatic in the sense of sort of oriented towards goals and purposes. And so in this sense, a pragmatic view of explanation is a view of explanation that sees it as kind of oriented towards a particular kind of goal. What is that goal? Here I'm going to rely on what I think of as Kim's truism. This is from a paper by Jaegwon Kim. And he says, the idea of explaining something is inseparable from the idea of making it intelligible. To seek an explanation of something is to seek to understand it, to render it intelligible. These are simple conceptual points, and I take them to be untendentious and uncontroversial. Indeed, I think they are untendentious and uncontroversial, but as Kim also sort of laments in that paper, not much has been made of them in discussions of explanation. They sometimes appear as kind of background, initial comments in the beginning of the paper, and then they kind of fall by the wayside. So the thought is maybe we can make more of this kind of simple, untendentious, uncontroversial claim. One comment to make here before I say a little bit more is, what is the relation? There is a set of views. If you look through discussions, kind of overviews of explanation, you will usually find a discussion of a pragmatic approach. What is the relation between what I'm saying and those approaches? Actually, I think those approaches, when you look into them, they're a mixed bag. They try, different authors like Bromberger, von Frossen, Achinstein, to an extent Michael Scriven, they're actually trying to do different things. And I think it's not, in some ways, it's not super helpful to group them under the same heading. What I'm going to say is, I think closest to Achinstein, although it's not that close, as we'll see. There's some important differences from what he went on about. And I think the idea of sort of explanation as being distinctive for its goal as opposed to its content is not something that's salient at all in Achinstein. Okay, so the Kim truism, to explain is to make the explanative understandable. So two big questions here are, what is making it? Like, what does the explanation have to sort of, how does the link between explanation and understanding work? And what is the relevant notion of understanding? And I'll try to say more about that, again, emphasizing the big picture. We can start by this view from Achinstein. This is pretty hard to read, and this is the simplest presentation I think exists. So Achinstein's in his own words, but I'm not going to go. There's a lot of detail in Achinstein, but I think the basic idea is this: an act or an episode of explaining is a communicative interaction in which an explainer intends to get their audience to understand something. And there's a lot about like what exactly is intending to get something. That's part one of Achinstein. And part two, again, this is, I think, the simplest sort of way in which he puts it. But again, we don't have to look at everything you said. The essential idea, again, of part two is an explanation, like a model, a claim, a theory, is a proposition which the explainer cites or can cite as the means to get their audience to understand something in an act of explaining. That's described before. So overall, the idea is that to explain is to intend to get an audience to understand, and an explanation is a proposition that can be cited in the course of such an interaction, an explanatory communicative interaction. This roughly corresponds to the Kim truism. To explain is to get the phenomenon, to get something understandable. But actually, I think suffers from pretty significant problems. The first is the focus on intention. Intending to produce understanding, maybe in some sense, their acts of explaining are beholden to that, but I don't think that's the relevant sense for us, right? I mean, I can try to explain to you how DNA gets replicated by showing you Bugs Bunny cartoons, all I like, and it's all going to succeed, and it doesn't count as an explanation. It doesn't matter what I intend to be doing, I think, in many ways. What matters is success, whether there's actual, at least potential generation of understanding. A more serious problem and kind of surprising thing about the Achinstein discussion is there's not much said about what understanding is, right? He conceives of it in terms of questions and answers, the correct answers to questions, but it puts very few constraints on what the actual sort of explanation can look like. This, by the way, is, I think, the place where there's a connection to these other pragmatic views. I think that's a common problem with a lot of them, is kind of a lack of a kind of substantive idea about what is achieved by explanation. Many of the the basic sort of criticism that I just voiced at Achinstein is voiced by Daniel Wilkenfled in the 2014 paper. And on the basis of those criticisms, he sort of offers a different kind of take. Also can be thought of as having two parts. One having to do with what an explaining act is, what an episode of explaining is, and what an explanation is, as derived from that. Again, I'm not going to look into it. I'm not going to read the details here. The overall idea is that an act of explaining involves one agent providing their audience with a representation, which, if they properly take up, gets them to understand. And the explanation is then the content of that representation. That's the basic Wilkenfeld view. And I'll assume that this, I think, is a big improvement, again, because it's motivated by the same kind of critiques of Achinstein. It doesn't include, at least not as a necessary kind of ingredient, intention, and it doesn't, and it focuses on success. Still, it's missing an account of understanding. Wilkenfeld has one in other papers. I think it's an essential ingredient in this overall story. So I'll just take this as a kind of rough formula. An explanation is a representation that, in the right circumstances and in the right hands, can engender understanding by its uptake. The next move is to say something about the underlying notion of understanding. As I think some of you know, at least, and as we saw in a lunchtime talk last week, there's a lot of work on this, on understanding, both in philosophy of science and in epistemology, and I'm not going to try to cover the vast kind of body of work that's emerged on this. I think the sort of relevant notion for us here, discussing scientific explanation, should have at least three features. First of all, it should be fairly narrow. So if you attended the talk last week, that was a talk in which understanding was conceived in very broad terms. And I don't necessarily disagree with that, but I think that there's sort of subkinds, and the relevant kind here is something like understanding why and how, something, for lack of a better term, is explanatory understanding, something understanding phenomena. Not, for instance, understanding a theory or understanding how to work with an instrument. Those kinds of things are what I'm going to decide. Secondly, understanding should be distinguishable, at least from simple sort of narrowly understood propositional knowledge. And I think what many authors point to in this direction is some sort of strong link to inferential abilities. So it's not just an attempt to kind of know what a proposition is, the ability to do something with it. Some people think that that could be understood as a form of knowledge, others don't, but that kind of richer sort of inferentially infused notion I think is important here. And thirdly, understanding should be objectively accessible. In a minimal sense, that means that just having a sense of understanding, an aha experience, that should not be enough, maybe even necessary for understanding. We want something that has kind of an objective, accessible, publicly accessible dimension. So a rough suggestion here, and I develop it a little bit further in a different paper, and there are a bunch of authors who make roughly this kind of suggestion, is as follows. Someone understands a phenomenon, a target phenomenon, to the extent that they're able to use a representation of the target phenomenon to draw counterfactual inferences about that phenomenon. You can make some arguments, which I'm not going to go over, that I think independently kind of motivate this kind of view based on how we assess and attribute understanding, the role of understanding in at least some scientific practice, and so on. But the main thing I want to focus on today is not like whether this is an independently plausible view. It's like, what kind of picture of explanation you get if we marry this to the idea that Kim's truism, if we sort of plug that into Kim's truism, and looking back at the problems that we saw with the so-called semantic view. You might also wonder about whether this view is specific enough. And my answer is no, it's not specific enough. It needs quite a bit of refinement. For instance, we need to say more about the relevant counterfactuals. They can't just be any counterfactuals. At the very least, maybe we need something like non-backtracking, if you know that from Lewis, or some analog of that. But we don't want to go all the way to sort of interventionist counterfactuals, because those would, I think, limit it to causal explanation. And we already think that causal explanation is one important, but not the sole species of explanation. So there's some kind of, and people like Alex Reutlingen have tried to map out what exactly that class of counterfactuals is. And I think it's something that would be needed. Another claim that it needs to be sort of stressed or maybe refined here is what exactly is the relationship between understanding and the ability to draw inferences. You might think it's the same thing, or you might think the ability is some kind of manifestation of an underlying cognitive state of understanding. I tend to the former, the identification claim, but I don't think that's essential for what I'm going to say today. But there's some strong link there, ability to make inferences is important. The third thing I want to say, the third refinement, there are others, but the third refinement is, well, there's like, whose ability, who's the sort of agent here that understands? In principle, I think we can apply this in any case, right? Any case in which there is explanation. But in many scientific cases, we're going to want to relativize it to relevant scientific experts. We're going to want to ask, given knowledge and skill set that the community of experts has, what kind of further inferences can they draw based on model, explanatory model? Okay, so putting these parts together, you get the following type of view: a representation, a model theory, is a scientific explanation of a phenomenon to the extent that it can be used to make the phenomenon understandable to a well-placed scientific expert. That is, to the extent that it allows such an expert to draw the right sorts of counterfactual inferences. And we would, again, there are details here. We need to say more about what counts as an implementation here, what counts as using it, and so forth. But let me just forge ahead and say, come back to the semantic view. I'm mindful of the time I have. I don't want to go too long. So I think it's pretty straightforward to see how this view will handle, it's in many ways designed to handle model-based explanations. A model's explanatory credentials are determined by its ability to generate understanding, and that holds even if, and in some cases maybe because of, the way in which it simplifies and idealizes the target phenomenon. That doesn't mean that the view is kind of committed to a sort of non-factivity about understanding. You could think that the relevant inferences are correct, but I think it still matters that the explanation, which I see as the target for a lot of at least traditional views of explanation, is in this kind of picture downplayed and not seen as something that we should sort of focus on to understand what an explanation is. Like the explanation in the sense of the model, the theory, and so on. And I think it's a pretty kind of interesting and significant fact here that actually figuring out what a model tells us about reality is often quite difficult. It's quite hard. And part of the attempt to sort of downplay the importance of thinking about the explanation as the content of the model is to do with that. We can employ something of a similar attitude to cases of non-causal explanation. The basic thought here would be that the non-causal elements are explanatory in virtue of enhancing understanding in potential users, which means in virtue of allowing them to draw the relevant inferences. Here, I think we would need to be a little bit careful about what kind of counterfactuals are involved, and I'm not saying that that task is not relevant and should be taken care of, but we should at least understand what is distinctive about some of these explanations, I think, by suggesting that in a given context, what the sort of relevant piece of information that we need in order to understand is this extra mathematical claim, right? And so the question in a way about whether the sort of mathematics is playing an ontic or a representational role, in some ways I want to say is not the right question to ask about these cases. What's going on is that in a relevant scientific context, the sort of missing piece of information is this mathematics, and that mathematics just allows you to draw certain inferences. I think that claim that mathematics allows us to draw certain inferences is acceptable to most people who looked at these cases. So that in a way, there's no need to sort the sort of distinctive from boring uses of mathematics, at least insofar as we're concerned with explanation. What about explanatory power? I think we can use understanding kind of first view to give at least the outlines of a story about explanatory power, where essentially the idea is that, well, a model is explanatory to the extent that it enhances our ability, or enhances as the, or let's say it this way, has the potential to enhance understanding, which is translated into the potential generation of these inferences. And we can further break this down. This is a nice paper from 2010 by Wilkenfled and Korokowski, where they break this down into a bunch of dimensions. I think 5 dimensions. I have 4 here, but I think they have 5. So I must have missed one. Oh, they have salience. So they say, well, this basic idea, we can now break it down into at least 5 dimensions. How important the inferences that this model allows us, how precise they are, how sensitive they are to various background conditions, how salient they are given the relevant context. We can debate whether these are the right dimensions, whether more and so on, but that would be the rough idea. And clearly this turns explanatory power into a pretty context-sensitive matter. It would depend on what other information, what other tools we have, because those would determine the relevant actual abilities to draw inferences. That, however, and I think this is a point they also make, would not make the issue subjective, at least not in an objectionable way. Okay. So I want to finish soon, and I want to just say a few more words about this kind of contrast between semantic and pragmatic, which I'm hoping, but you'll tell me if you agree, is a useful framing here and how I sort of understand it. The word explanation can be used, I think, in at least 3 main ways. One, and I've used it throughout in this way, I've tried to distinguish these, but now I want to make this distinction explicit. The first is an explanation can be a kind of, the first we might label an explanatory episode, and that's an attempt or a communicative interaction in which one party tries to make a phenomenon understandable to another party. Smith gave an explanation in his talk of the emergence of the COVID-19 pandemic. Explanation is used with that. Sometimes we use explanation to denote facts, right? Relations, structures in the world, so to speak, that are cited in the course of this kind of episode. So the explanation why Jones fell ill is that he was infected with a certain virus. The explanation there refers to a certain fact or relationship between Jones and the virus. Lastly, there's an explanatory vehicle, something like a model or a theory, or something of that sort, which is basically, I call it a vehicle because you can think of it as the means by which a set of facts is conveyed in the course of a kind of episode of explaining. Right? So if I say the SEIR model provides an explanation of the dynamics of the pandemic, and I'm using an explanation in that vehicle. I think it's fair to say that most of philosophical discussions traditionally were focused on the vehicle sense, in the sense they ask the question, what is an explanatory model? What is a theory? When does a theory explain? Something of that sort. And what I've called semantic views aim to answer that question by pointing to factual content. They say a theory or a model explains because it tells us what the causes or mechanisms and so on of underlying the phenomenon are. The pragmatic view that I've tried to sketch de-emphasizes vehicles in favor of explanatory episodes and sort of the way in which factual information is conveyed in them. It doesn't, of course, deny that there are these vehicles, there are these means, but it sort of tries to downplay their role. It tries to suggest that the means by which we explain something to a given audience can be not very stable, can often, change depending on context and so on. And really, there's no sort of stable factual sort of content that an explanation has, in virtue of which it's an explanation or as good an explanation as it is. Having said that, I think that at least the version that I've presented here indirectly includes a kind of semantic element, because I've restricted the relevant inferences, the understanding associated inferences, to counterfactual inferences, or to a certain class of counterfactual inferences, and that indirectly will affect the kind of contents they have, right? I think some people have written an understanding of not not on that whole, and their view is maybe more purely pragmatic. I don't think it totally works, largely because of that. Just before I conclude, what is a few sort of just comments about what this view doesn't deny. It doesn't, of course, deny there are causal and potentially other dependency relations in the world, and that they matter, and that we can potentially have philosophical accounts of them, right? Of saying what causation. It also doesn't deny that a well-supported explanation is, in some sense, informative and tells us about the world. But I think it does say, it does suggest that what such explanations, models, and so on tell us is often quite hard to figure out, and is highly context sensitive. And secondly, that the sort of objectivity and objective status of assessments of explanatory power is not a matter, at least not purely or primarily, of what explanations say, but of what they sort of allow us to do. That's the sort of pragmatic. All right. Summarizing. While Heppel's views are no longer accepted, I think in some ways the agenda set back then is still kind of alive and well, and I more or less accepted that agenda, and given it presented a view in which explanations are distinctive for having a particular goal. That goal is generating understanding. Explanatory vehicles in context can be objectively assessed by looking at the correctness of the counterfactual inferences that they permit. But in a sense, the real players are explanatory facts on the one hand, and explanatory episodes in which those facts are sort of conveyed, where the explanation in the sense of a vehicle of explaining, is background. And the main thing I'm trying to suggest in favor of this view is that it allows us sort of well-designed to handle the kinds of views that have been debated from a semantic kind of viewpoint in recent decades. I also think that this view, but I'll leave this for another time, but I think there are other things that you can sort of take this view, other implications that it has. For instance, it allows us to quite quickly reject the idea of inference to the best explanation, right? There's still questions about what's going on in those kinds of cases, but there's a pretty clear basis on which we reject, I think, IBE. And it also suggests that certain avenues of studying, scientific study of explanation and understanding are sort of helpful. But as I say, I'll leave that for another time.
Can we take a 2-minute break?
No, you actually did very well. Actually,
My name has been so.
that's fine.